there's definitely been something quieter about the reaction we've seen this time around with the second budget bill as opposed to C-38 in the spring. Now, whether that's because the bill itself is less egregious or less inflammatory in certain aspects, whether it's just because it's December and people are starting to tune out, it's difficult to say. At the same time, the opposition parties have been throwing any number of procedural gambits at this bill, some successful, some not quite successful in trying to tie the government up in the legislature. Now, going forward is where this battle, again, has to continue if the opposition parties really want to make something of this. If this really is a fight about democracy, then it needs to keep happening, essentially, as many times as there are omnibus bills. And I think at some point the opposition parties need to get serious about this. If they really do want to take a stand against omnibus legislation and really kind of come out hard against this as a serious problem, then they need to put some proposals on the table and say, here's what should happen, here's what we would do, here are the rules that need to change. You know, there's always a discussion up here about what's wrong with Parliament, about what's wrong with question period, about what's wrong with the House. At some point, all of these people complaining about things need to start putting some proposals on the table that actually could substantively change things.
Unsuccessfully and foolishly. Israel's handling of the vote has been unsuccessful because while it never expected to defeat the motion, it launched a major diplomatic push to at least gain some sort of moral majority against the motion, and it failed. Only 9 nations in the world voted against the Palestinians. Many democracies, many Israeli allies voted with the Palestinians. So it failed diplomatically, and it was a foolish move if we look at the bigger picture because the Palestinians are divided between Hamas and Fatah on the West Bank. Hamas sends rockets regularly against Israel, and Israel just negotiated a ceasefire with Hamas over the Gaza war. Fatah, led by Mahmoud Abbas, who has pushed this vote at the United Nations, is committed to nonviolent tactics, and Israel responds to this with threats, according to Israeli press reports today, the plans to build 3,000 new housing units. So if one is in favor of a two-state solution, it's difficult to understand how marginalizing the nonviolent Palestinian negotiating partner advances that cause in any way. Israel is trying to weaken the person with whom they might be able to negotiate a peace, and meanwhile the violent Palestinian actor Hamas has been strengthened. Canada's response is baffling. Canada announced it was recalling its envoys from the region, ostensibly for consultations. This is difficult to swallow. If Foreign Minister John Baird wants to consult with someone, he can pick up the phone. It's a symbolic move to show Canada's firm disapproval, and again, if Canada is committed to a two-state solution, it's hard to see how aligning itself with this extreme minority against the Palestinian movement, which is committed to peaceful means, advances that position in any way.
The Green Party had a great week, but it was probably the worst great week they ever could have hoped for. They performed quite well in 2 by-elections on Monday night in Calgary Centre and in Victoria, well beyond expectations. In both, particularly in Victoria, where they almost won, where Donald Galloway almost unseated the NDP. Unfortunately, that was probably the biggest news day in some time when Rob Ford and Mark Carney, two pretty prominent people in Canadian politics, had some big news, were featured prominently in the news. And the other bad thing for the Greens, the other unfortunate thing was that when they were performing so well in Victoria, everyone in the East had already gone to sleep, at least at newspapers, so that the news of their near victory didn't make the newspapers. The next day, on Wednesday, they did get some credit in papers for performing fairly well, but by that point, of course, pundits had talked about how unimportant by-elections really are, how they really mean nothing so far away from a general election, and maybe the Greens were the surprise sort of, quote, winners of the night, but it doesn't really mean much. And going forward, there was some talk about how Elizabeth May now, if there is any discussion in coming years about cooperation among the left-leaning parties, or at least the anti-conservative parties, she might have a more prominent voice at that table than she otherwise would have. But that's so far down the road, who knows how much traction that's really going to have. So there was a lot of stuff that went well for the Greens this week, but its lasting power is questionable.
Well, he's a pretty impressive guy, but beyond that, I think we should think for a moment about the context. Carney came to Canada, left a career in investment banking, and joined the Bank of Canada in 2003. Think about what's happened since then. Paul Martin flamed out worse than anyone could have predicted. Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff were dismantled. In the meantime, some of the other potential big names that mainstream large L liberals might have backed, thinking about guys like John Manley and Frank McKenna, they stepped way back from partisan politics and really withdrew themselves from the fray. So for a certain kind of liberal, kind of elite liberals who think that they are and should be just a little bit out of power right now, not far out of power, who was left to dream about? If you weren't ready to make the leap of faith on Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney was really the only game in town. So now that's been taken away, although maybe not for good. He's signed up for a 5-year hitch at the Bank of England that's shorter than the normal 8-year term, so who knows, might be back again.
To tell this story properly, we have to go back a ways. At the beginning of 2009, when Jim Prentice had been Environment Minister for all of 2 months, an environmental impact assessment landed on his desk, telling him all the risk to species at-risk habitats that would be posed by 1,275 shallow gas wells being drilled by Encana at CFB Suffield National Wildlife Area. That's early 2009. Since then, a bunch of stuff has happened since that report landed on the Environment Minister's desk. The Environment Minister retired of old age. The company changed its name. A new minister came in and spent 2.5 years telling people how great natural resource development is. And on Friday morning, Peter Kent got up on his hind legs and said, we're not going to allow those 1,275 natural gas wells in a national wildlife area that's full of protected habitat. We're not going to allow that company, which has changed its name because it was waiting so long, to double the number of natural gas wells in the protected wildlife habitat area. And then Peter Kent says, this proves that we're serious about the environment. It is to laugh. And he said he was making the decision under a law that was passed in 2012, year 7 of this whole process. So what we learned about the Environment Minister this week is that no one should ever accuse him of not having a sense of humor.